Hey, why are you wearing a lab coat? And why do you have a snail? Well, I'm a scientist, so that's why I have a lab coat. And I'm doing an experiment on snails. Oh, well, what's your experiment then? Well, we are exposing predatory marine snails to food stimuli and noxious stimuli and observing their feeding or avoidance behaviors. I'm also examining the effect that hunger or satiation levels have on the snail's behavior. How are you doing all of this? That sounds absurd. Well, first we chose betaine as our feeding stimulant, as it is a common feeding stimulant in marine carnivores. Secondly, we chose taurine as the noxious stimulant that should cause avoidance behavior. Okay, but how do you tell if a snail is hungry or not? Well, we're defining hunger as readiness to feed, and we created different satiation states by feeding or not feeding the snails. And from this, we can expose them to different concentrations of either betaine or taurine, and we can see at what concentration the snails will display proboscis extension or biting, which we call feeding response. If they turn away or withdraw, we call this avoidance response. And we were able to create either a feeding threshold or an avoidance threshold. When we were testing the effectiveness of different feeding stimuli, we saw that the lower concentrations of stimuli could sometimes produce avoidance behavior, and increasing the strength of the stimuli resulted in acting feeding behaviors, and it suppressed the avoidance behaviors. So we thought we would further examine this. That sounds interesting, but what exactly did you do, and what did you find? Well, we found that satiation raises feeding thresholds and suppresses avoidance. In one experiment, we took a group of snails that were not fed and a group of snails that were fed, and we looked at the differences between feeding and avoidance behaviors. We exposed them to betaine and found that the lower concentrations of betaine caused the hungry snails to display feeding behaviors, while the more full snails required a higher concentration of betaine. So that means their feeding threshold was higher because it took a stronger stimulus to cause a feeding behavior. We also found that satiated snails more often displayed avoidance behaviors in response to betaine than the hungry snails. Well, that sounds cool, but what about noxious stimulus and all that other stuff? In another experiment, we found that exposing hungry snails to taurine which is a noxious stimulant, could cause a feeding response, where it normally would cause an avoidance behaviors in satiated snails. In the group that had a feeding response, they also displayed avoidance behavior after the initial feeding response. Basically, we found that really hungry snails are going to show feeding behaviors at lower concentrations of betaine, while not hungry snails are going to need a much stronger stimulus in order to begin feeding. When presented with a noxious stimulant like taurine, the hungry snails are more likely to begin to feed, while the not hungry snails are going to avoid it. So what's the point of all of this? We think that the results suggest that the snails are weighing out the cost benefits of foraging and feeding. Snails that are full may not want to feed on something, even if it's giving off food signals, because it may cause the snail to be vulnerable to other predators that are similarly attracted, or the food might not be worth the energy needed to capture and eat it. On the other hand, feeding behavior with noxious stimuli may happen in really hungry snails because they have a greater nutrient need than the fuller snails, and so they might be more willing to take a risk for the payoffs. So, well, that sounds very interesting. maybe you can give me a practical demonstration of this. Well, sure, I have a snail right over here. Let's go look. Oh, look, a snail in his natural environment. This pack of ramen represents a lower concentration of betaine. Now, even though it's a lower concentration, this snail is very hungry, so he says, food, and he begins his feeding response. Similarly, this piece of broccoli represents taurine, a noxious stimuli. So he's still very hungry, so he sees this and says, well, I don't really like broccoli. It's giving off a bad signal, but I think the benefits might outweigh the cost, so I'll eat it anyway. And he also exhibits a feeding response. He'll also exhibit an avoidance response afterwards and leave. In a full snail, a more satiated snail, he'll see this low concentration of betaine and he'll say, it might not be worth my time, and he'll have an avoidance response. And when he sees this piece of broccoli, the taurine, he'll say, ugh, broccoli, I don't need this, and he'll immediately have an avoidance response. If there's a high concentration of betaine, he'll say, well, this might be more worth my time, and he might have a feeding response, which represents a higher feeding threshold for the more satiated snails. But it might be worth, the cost might outweigh the, the benefits outweigh the cost, so I'm going to eat it anyway. But wait, when there's more, he might say, maybe this might be worth my time, and he'll start the feed. And then, I lost the broccoli, but if there is broccoli, he would say, a snail.
Wait, I think it didn't start. I think you started talking before the beep.
Mary!
You gotta wait for the beep, Kelly!